Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell here with a review of 007 First Light, which was released on May 27th for PS5, Xbox, and Windows. This is my first ever video game review here on the channel, and I doubt that this is going to be a regular feature, but I thought it was appropriate because I'm a big James Bond fan, and this acts as the possible Kickstarter for a James Bond universe that tells an ongoing 007 story in a completely different medium, which would be unprecedented territory for Bond outside of books and movies. Even though this is my first video game review, this is not my first time playing a James Bond video game. Like millions of other millennials, I spent countless hours playing GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64, usually with friends, and a total ban on playing as Oddjob or with the Golden Gun. I also owned 2001's Agent Under Fire and 2002's Nightfire, and I played 2005's From Russia with Love, which technically featured the final performance of Sean Connery as James Bond. But all of those were tie-ins to James Bond's cinematic adventures, whereas First Light is a James Bond origin story set apart from any film timeline. In the game's opening scene, we find Bond as a young, inexperienced airman on an ill-fated SAS mission who's thrown into action when he's the only person left alive following a mid-mission attack on his squad. Despite MI6's reluctance to use him on the ground, he is their only option, and his abilities and risk-taking inspire British intelligence to recruit him as a potential 00 agent, a program that's recently been revived and is being rebuilt from the ground up. This initial introduction and brief mission is basically both the prologue and a light fighting tutorial, and it's followed by a full-on James Bond title sequence that fits squarely into the Bond cinematic tradition, with an original song from Lana Del Rey and longtime franchise composer David Arnold. This is his first Bond work since composing the score for Quantum of Solace, and his first Bond-themed song since Casino Royale's You Know My Name. And truth be told, it's my favorite Bond title song since Skyfall back in 2012. If you're interested in playing this game, you should know that it is not a first-person shooter or an action-first option like a lot of James Bond games. It is entirely third-person and involves as much stealth, spying, and sneaking as fighting and shooting. I can be kind of touch and go with those kinds of games, but I have to say I enjoyed this one for the most part. After a few levels of fully relying on your wits and fists, you eventually do get the help of a Q lens that allows you to see where enemies are, and you slowly acquire gadgets to incapacitate enemies and targets when fighting and shooting either aren't an option or you need some extra assistance. But because this is about Bond's early days at MI6, you don't get access to guns and gadgets right away, and I actually really enjoyed how the game does its gameplay training, which coincides with Bond's actual training. You learn to fight, shoot, and drive in a tutorial that's structured like a montage, which I thought was a really fun way to do the practical work of teaching you to play the game while keeping the game's cinematic feel. Bond goes through his training with a group of fellow recruits, which gives the early part of the game kind of a Kingsman feel. This is a younger Bond than we've ever seen in the movies, and I liked his portrayal by Patrick Gibson, who may best be known for taking on the role of Dexter in the prequel series Dexter: Original Sin. He has all of the essential qualities of James Bond: the confidence, the reckless attitude, and yes, a love for women, but he's still inexperienced and not completely the super agent we know from the movies. He also has a scar on his face, which he gets in the game's opening mission, a detail of Bond's appearance from Ian Fleming's novels that hasn't been present in any cinematic adaptation. Gibson's performance may not have the distinct charisma of a Sean Connery or Roger Moore, but he brings the vitality, arrogance, and wit that are required for the character. I also liked Lenny James as Greenway, Bond's tough MI6 trainer who flat out doesn't like him, but eventually becomes a trusted ally. Following training, Bond begins his proper work for MI6, headed by Priyanka Burford's M, who, like Bond, is also new to her position and looking to prove herself. Moneypenny, played by Keira Lester, is set free from the desk outside of M's office and works as Bond's girl in the chair, providing mission briefings and intel updates. Bond's entry to MI6 is also where the more modern elements of the story take hold, as British intelligence is intertwined with artificial intelligence and a supercomputer called Thea, which has a flawless record and risks making human intelligence officers and 00 agents obsolete. But if you're familiar with James Bond overall, or how stories like these operate, then it probably isn't a surprise that eventually a human super agent like James Bond turns out to be crucial to the fate of the world, which is an especially ironic turn given that Amazon, which now owns James Bond, has pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into AI development. It would have been easy to set this game either in an unspecified time period or maybe back in the 1960s, but I liked that First Light was able to tell a classic Bond story in a modern setting. Because Bond is still earning his stripes, the first half of the game or so is much more reliant on spycraft and sneaking around than shooting and gadgets, which makes sense on a story level, but it can be a bit frustrating as a player. The game is structured like a movie, which means your skills develop in accordance with a 3-act structure, and you get most of your fancy weapons and gadgets toward the end. That makes some of the early levels feel a little repetitive, but the slow buildup is worth a lot of the fun that you get in the back half as Bond travels the globe and has full access to the Q-Lab, a license to kill, and upgraded skills and abilities. Getting there does require a little patience, though. The unexpected side of playing as James Bond in a game this story-driven and immersive is that, though the character himself is immortal, mostly, you are not immortal in the game, and if you don't get things right, James Bond dies. Of course, you get a chance at a do-over, but it can deflate the excitement of playing as 007, especially when you're a gamer like me who requires a little bit of trial and error to survive a level. The way I justified it to myself is that this game is like a James Bond multiverse, and like Doctor Strange taught us all, there are many possible realities, but just one path to final victory. So every time I died, I just imagined that I'd played in one of the countless multiverses that were more realistic, and saw Bond killed in the line of duty. After all, he is always surviving 1,000,000 to 1 odds. In reality, sometimes he would just get beaten up and killed by a random security guard. At least that's what I told myself. The Bond that I took all the way to the end was the sum total of all my mistakes, who gets to save the world in the final timeline. And if there's any gamer out there that can get Bond all the way to the end without dying, well, I salute you. Just for your information, I played the game on the recommended medium difficulty, and while the game wasn't consistently frustrating, there were a few levels that would have had a younger me throwing his controller across the room. Luckily, the more mature me can just pause, take a breath, maybe grab a sandwich or something. This is not a game where you can fight or shoot your way out of every situation. Strategy is often required, and the fighting also isn't just senseless button mashing. There are defensive moves and combinations that are often essential to success, and you don't get an unlimited amount of damage to take. Survival requires careful planning and patience. One way in which the game offers multiple paths that doesn't require multiverse headcanon to explain away poor gameplay is how it offers a few different ways to complete a mission. Some options are stealth heavy, some rely more on spycraft and puzzle solving, and some allow you to fight more with higher odds of dying. You can try to talk your way out of trouble, infiltrate private areas, or take a more aggressive approach. And not only does this allow you to customize your path to the end, but it also offers you options for replaying certain missions. Some achievements can be unlocked by replaying levels and taking a different path, which I think extends the life of the game, because this is not an open world like Red Dead Redemption that you can come back to and just wander around whenever you want. For now, your gameplay options are limited to the in-game missions as well as multiple training simulations focused on specific skills. Because of this, I would imagine that First Light will be a much more focused playing experience for a lot of people who will play the story, unlock what they want, and then probably move on altogether until new DLC is released. One of my favorite things about the game is how seamlessly it's able to feel like a Bond movie. Because globetrotting is such a hallmark of the franchise, it feels natural that each level, especially in the back half of the game, is in a completely different location. In trying to solve the mystery of a rogue 00 agent, Bond finds himself in places like Egypt, Vietnam, Slovakia, and Antarctica, while also conducting stealth spycraft at a fancy black tie gala, and at one point taking on bad guys inside MI6 itself, which allows for a very fun level inside the Q-Lab where Bond can turn the full arsenal of Q's gadgetry against a team of bad guys. There are also a ton of set pieces, usually acting as the grand finale of each level, that involve mountainside car chases, fighting bad guys inside a crashing airplane, running across the rooftops of London, and at one point finding yourself strapped down, facing certain death in a situation right out of Goldfinger. If I had to pick a favorite level, it would probably be the one set in Vietnam, which comes in the last third of the game, which combines all the skills you've learned so far with amazing location and level design and the grand scale that you'd expect from a James Bond movie. In fact, this level I think would be the finale of a typical Bond movie, but because this is a game and the gamers rightfully expect a longer experience, First Light does eventually have to break out of the 3-act structure to ensure that you're getting your money's worth. In general, I'd say that I had a good time playing First Light. It was sometimes a bit repetitive and a bit frustrating. There's very little hand-holding, and some of these spycraft puzzles took a while to work out, at least for me. There were also some levels that I felt were a bit too too challenging. I mean, I could have lowered the difficulty level, but I really wanted to figure things out on my own, which I eventually did, but it sometimes interrupted the momentum of my game. There was also one bit of casting Lenny Kravitz as a pirate king called Bavma that I didn't think was the best. Kravitz's performance felt phoned in and stood out against the other solid performances, but generally 007 First Light allows you to play out every scenario you can imagine as James Bond, from wanton destruction of property to cold-hearted revenge, with pithy one-liners following each major achievement. It offers a variability of gameplay and scenarios that I don't remember getting from other Bond games, and it actually feels like a solid, modern Bond story with interesting twists and turns, and yes, an open door for a sequel. So on my personal scale, I'm giving 007 First Light and its good rating, especially for gamers who enjoy the story as much as the gameplay itself. I had a really good time playing as Bond. And speaking of a sequel, if the early reports of the game's success continue to bear out, it seems likely that there will be a sequel to 007 First Light. The game initially entered development years ago when Eon still had the rights to James Bond, and it was self-published by IO Interactive due to the changeover in rights. IOI is the game developer that was also behind the Hitman series, but now that they own the license, Amazon has said that they will handle any future sequels under MGM and Amazon Game Studios. If Amazon is smart, I hope they'll allow IOI's team to continue taking the lead in developing any potential sequels while handling the publishing themselves, instead of stepping in and ruining a good start. Should Amazon smother this promising new series after just one game, Jeff Bezos may actually become the Bond villain that everyone jokes that he is, for completely different reasons. So those are my thoughts on 007 First Light. Like I said, my first ever game review here on the channel. What do you think? Do you have the game? Have you played the game? Are you interested in playing the game? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, stay tuned right here for the latest in movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.